So good evening, everyone, and welcome to our April meetup for Data in the Greater Good. I'm Elaine Gamble, Community Leader for Data in the Greater Good, and we are a community of over 2,000 people where our focus is the use of data in mission-driven organizations. The arts, social justice, volunteerism, education, among other areas. Organizations come and talk to us about the beauty of data and how it advances their mission, either data, analytics, technologies, or their data journey, where they started out in terms of beginning to adopt more rigorous data practices and where they are now. And it's been wonderful to continue to have community during these virtual times. And we're honored to have with us tonight Givewell, charity reviews and research, and they provide recommendations on where to give. I'm also joined by my colleague, Bill Prickett, who is doing the video recording of tonight's talk. Givewell seeks to find and recommend outstanding giving opportunities to donors. It has a very short list of top charities, just 9 organizations in 2021. It's highly selective. In this talk, you'll hear how Givewell arrives at its recommendations by analyzing evidence and estimating cost effectiveness to narrow down a long list of promising programs. And we are honored to have with us tonight Catherine Hollander, Senior Communications Officer from Givewell. To tell you more about Catherine focuses on sharing Givewell's research as effectively as possible. She graduated from Yale University with a bachelor's in history, and she has worked as a journalist covering economics and healthcare for National Journal and as an editorial director for Beacon, an independent funding platform for journalism. She joined Givewell in 2015. And Catherine is joined by Ben Bateman, head of growth at Givewell. And at Givewell, he leads growth projects and website management. Prior to Givewell, Ben had a very impressive career in launching client startups in various markets that include China. He holds a bachelor's in English literature from Lewis and Clark College. And in his spare time, he can be found outside or in a book. So we're really excited to have both Catherine and Ben tonight to talk with us about how data enables Givewell to provide its wealth of recommendations and giving opportunities to donors. If you have questions as Catherine is speaking and Ben as well, you can just simply type them into the chat box, and at the end we will call on you to share your question with our speakers. So on that note, I will turn it over to Catherine, our primary speaker, and she will be supported by Ben. Again, welcome to Data in the Greater Good.
Great, thank you so much for inviting us to come speak. We're really excited about the conversation and going to try to share an overview of our work in 30 minutes as best we can, but really encourage you to ask any questions that you have afterward, and happy to kind of dig into anywhere that there's interest in exploring in a little more detail. Technology is working, so yeah, I'm going to focus this talk on how Givewell identifies opportunities to help donors have maximum impact with their gifts. So as Elaine mentioned, we are a nonprofit that's dedicated to finding and recommending outstanding giving opportunities. And what that means is that we publish a very short list of top charities. Elaine mentioned that we just have 9 on our list right now. So we publish this very short list of recommendations for donors that are on our website, free, anyone can use them. And we also publish the full details of the reasoning behind our recommendation alongside that. So we share all this information freely for anyone to use. Our goal is not to be a broad evaluator of as many organizations as possible. We're not a charity navigator where the idea is to have everyone listed and you can come and see what we think of them. Our goal is really to narrow in on the places where we can confidently recommend to donors a giving opportunity where they can have a lot of impact. So that's a way in which we're different from what you might think of when you think of a typical charity evaluator. So Givewell has grown a lot since we were started. We actually were started in 2007. This chart just picks up at 2011, but you can see that since then we've directed over $700 million to the charities that we recommend, and over 60,000 donors have given based on our recommendation. So we've been really excited to see all this growth since our beginnings. And we've also gotten some great press. We link to all these stories on our website if you're curious to read more, but basically I've just been really excited to see the community developing around thinking about giving in this evidence-backed way that we recommend. So in this talk, I'm really going to focus on how Givewell uses evidence to look deeply at the most promising giving opportunities, ultimately to answer what sounds like it should be a simple question, which is, where can I do the most good with my donation? But before I talk about how we do this, I want to spend just a few minutes on why we approach giving in this way. We know that it might be counterintuitive, some of the approaches that we take. And so we want to just share some of the fundamental views that guide the way that we approach finding opportunities to recommend. The first is that we value lives everywhere. So our goal is to do as much good as possible with each donation, so to help as many people as we can. And we don't prioritize people that are located geographically close to us. So this is a different approach than the approach that you might have heard of, which is charity starts at home. We should begin in our own communities. We take a global view and say we're interested in helping people as much as possible, and we're agnostic about where they're located. The next fundamental view that we have is that we're open to any cause. So rather than starting our charitable giving journey by saying, what am I personally passionate about, or what has personally affected me? We start by asking, where can we do the most good? And we're open to evidence leading us to any potential answer. So, we don't start by narrowing in based on what we're interested in. We really remain open to all potential opportunities, so long as they are pointed to by the evidence and their potential ability to do a lot of good. And what that's led us to learn is just how different the impacts of different programs can be. So here we looked into a US education organization called KIP that works with students, and we estimate that they can help each student for about $9,000 to $20,000 for 1 year. And when we look at organizations that work in an area like global health, we see really different cost effectiveness. So for an organization that we recommend that works on malaria prevention, we estimate that $3,000 to $5,000 can avert one death from malaria. And that's most likely of a child under the age of 5. And so while these are both, good outcomes, they're very different in their cost effectiveness. So for $9,000, you could potentially help one student go to school for 1 year, or you could potentially prevent 2 to 3 children of dying from malaria. And that's a really large difference in impact. And this isn't to pick on KIP. This is really about the difference in program selection and geography. So working on US education is more expensive than working on some of the global health and development programs that we've assessed. So we've learned that there just can be really large differences in how much a donation can do depending on which program you're supporting. So now I want to get back to this question of how we do this. That's a bit of the why we do this and why we approach our thinking in this way, but how we really start to look at the evidence to figure out the answer to this question. How can I do the most good with my donation? And this question really kicked off the existence of Givewell back in 2006, when our co-founders were working in finance and like many of us, interested in making a donation to charity. And what being sort of the numbers-minded people that they were, they really wanted to know, where's the data? How do I know that this donation is going to be used really well? And not even just really well, but how can I figure out where is the best place to donate? Where can I do the most good? And so they started to look for opportunities to answer that question, and it turned out to be extremely difficult. Very little information was available for them to assess the impact of charitable organizations that they might support. They looked for information from charities that could demonstrate that the programs that they were implementing were effective, and they found it almost impossible to come by. So charities tend to be able to point to things like the number of children that they reach. For example, if we're working on a program that serves children, they can say, we serve this many children. But the thing that we really care about if we're interested in doing as much good as possible is how those children's lives are impacted by the program. So we're looking for information on the outcomes of that program. Are you improving their health, or increasing their wealth? So really focusing on those outcomes. And what we found is that it's not typical that charities have that sort of information about their own impacts. They tend to be very focused on implementing their programs, and that they don't have this piece of information. So that was a really hard question to get information on when they were looking for information from the charities themselves. They also found that it was surprisingly difficult to get information about the activities of organizations by looking at their website. So just figuring out, what charities actually did sort of on a day-to-day basis. And so all of this was just really hard to come by from searching on the internet, looking at charities' websites. But they did realize that some really helpful information was available, and that there was a lot of it. And that information is academic research. So there are a lot of economists, epidemiologists, and others who study different ways that we can improve life outcomes. And so there's sort of a wealth of academic research to draw upon. And so they found that what they could do was to look at this research to help them figure out which are the programs that might be the most cost-effective ways to help, and to focus on those. And so we had this problem. There was very little information available for donors to assess impact. And the solution is really doing this rigorous research to figure out which programs are most effective, and then to share that information on our website and with anyone who might be interested in using it, so that others who are in a similar situation wanting to figure out where their donation can do a lot of good can rely on the work that has already been done. And so our co-founders had been working on this just as a part-time project back in 2006, and realized that this was a full-time question to answer. And so they left their jobs in finance in 2007 and founded Givewell to focus on this project full-time. And we're now a 40-person organization and still very focused on this question of, where can we do the most good? How do we find the best opportunities for donors? And so how do we identify this list of recommendations, given our focus? Well, our research process operates like a funnel. There's a lot of places that we could consider looking, but since we're just interested in finding the ones that really help maximize impact and have a lot of evidence behind them, we start with a consideration of a very large number of programs, and we narrow it down to recommending a short list of the programs that best meet our criteria. And when we originally started Givewell, we looked at all kinds of programs all over the world, and including in the United States, where Givewell's co-founders were based. And what we found through that process was that the strongest evidence and the most cost-effective programs tended to be in the area of global health and poverty alleviation. So we focus on global health and poverty alleviation, again, not because we decided we were going to do that before Givewell was started, but because that's where the evidence led us to focus. And I'll show you a few charts that help illustrate why we think this is a particularly good space to work in. So this shows that, despite a lot of progress having been made in recent years, many children continue to die before the age of 5. And these deaths are not equally distributed all over the globe. So we see, the orange and yellow is the areas where there are higher rates of child mortality. In addition, many children die of preventable causes. So I know this is a lot of text on this slide, but a few that I would call out here are malaria, diarrheal diseases, and pneumonia. We know how to treat these and prevent these diseases, and it's really inexpensive to do so. So when we look at the burden of disease, the places that it's concentrated, this really leads us to focus on these global health problems that have been really well studied and are really inexpensive to provide. So that's sort of the first narrowing of the research funnel, starting from every possible thing we could think of down to global health and poverty alleviation. But within that space, so even within global health and poverty alleviation, it's a really large area. There's lots of different programs, and we need to figure out which ones we should focus on within that big area. So we're still winnowing it down from there. And we use these 4 criteria to help us do that, to help us identify the opportunities where we can recommend with confidence to donors a place where they can do a lot of good. So these are the 4 criteria we use, and I'll walk through each of them. The first is evidence of effectiveness. So there are a lot of programs that seem like they might be good, but we actually don't have evidence showing that they are. And this is really important because some ideas that sound promising can turn out to be actively harmful. So there's a picture of a merry-go-round on this slide, and this is part of a program called, well, not this particular picture is not from the program Play Pumps, but this idea of using a merry-go-round is part of a program called Play Pumps. And Play Pumps was a program that tried to solve this problem that in some parts of the world, it could be very time-consuming and burdensome to pump water. So you have to go to the well and use a hand pump to pump water. And that was, really time-intensive. And so they had an idea to replace those hand pumps with merry-go-rounds that children could play on, with the idea that, kids will like to play on this. Those merry-go-round spinning was the mechanism by which water was drawn from the well. And it was sort of this win-win idea. Kids would play on it, they would have fun, and water would be pumped, and you would remove this burdensome process. And a lot of people thought this sounded like a really good idea. So celebrities got on board, international aid organizations received a lot of positive attention and funding. But what they found was that it actually turned out that these pumps were much harder to use than the old hand pumps. Kids didn't end up really playing on them. And so basically what happened was that the adults who were gathering water had to go and turn the play pumps by themselves, and they were very heavy and much harder to use than the old hand pumps. And this is kind of a good story in that we eventually learned about this, that people eventually figured out that these weren't working. But it's also a story about how it can be really dangerous to not understand if your program is working before supporting it, because you can actively do harm, actively make lives more difficult. So we think it's really important to have strong evidence that a program that you're supporting is actually helping, and not just telling a good story about how it could potentially help. So evidence of effectiveness is our first criterion. The second criteria we look at is the cost effectiveness of a program. So this is very tightly tied to our mission to find places that help donors do as much good as possible per dollar. So we really want to look at programs that get a high return for the spending that you do. This is not the same as looking at how much money organizations spend on their overhead compared to their programs. The overhead ratio is unfortunately a popular way that people like to talk about the effectiveness of charities, but we think it's actually one of the worst ways that you can try to understand how good an organization is, because there are a lot of overhead expenses that can really increase the amount of impact that an organization can have. So you could imagine hiring staff that have more technical expertise that can help you implement your program more effectively. And that costs money, but is really important to increase your impact. You could pay surveyors to go and check with people who participate in your program to see how effective the program was. And that costs money, but again, can really help you have more impact. So overhead spending can be a really valuable tool. And so we don't think it's important to focus on getting that number as low as possible. We focus instead on the outcomes that an organization can achieve per dollar donated. So what I mean by that is if a program saved 5 lives for the same cost as another program saved 1 life, we would be interested in supporting the program that saves 5 lives. So we look at those types of outcomes to assess the cost effectiveness. The next criteria that we use is something we call room for more funding. This aspect of donating doesn't tend to get as much attention, but we think it's really important. And this is whether an organization can use more dollars to do more good. So we don't just want to look back at an organization's track record and see if they've spent funds well, though certainly that's a helpful input in our understanding of how effective they are. We also really want to understand what every additional dollar will enable them to do. And organizations can sometimes be limited in how much additional funding they can absorb at any given time. So you can imagine, for example, if you gave a really small local charity $1 billion overnight, they might have some trouble spending it quickly because they sort of weren't prepared to expand that quickly. They might not have the staff that would be needed to disperse that funding. So we look very closely at how well organizations can spend additional dollars and not just what they've done in the past. And the final criteria that we use is transparency. So the above criteria might have suggested it, but we ask the organizations that we review for a lot of information about their operations and their program. And we share the full analysis that we do with donors who use our research. So anyone on the internet who wants to come to our website and read everything that we've written. So it's really important to us that programs that we review and recommend are not only transparent with us so that we can fully understand how they operate, but that they're also willing for us to be really transparent about our views and why we recommend them. So I'm going to go through these criteria one more time with a really specific example, which is a group called Malaria Consortium that we recommend. And Malaria Consortium is an organization that implements a program called Seasonal Malaria Chemoprevention, which is a very long term, so I'm going to refer to it as SMC. But all that seasonal malaria chemoprevention, or SMC, means is it's a preventive anti-malarial medication that's given to young children in areas where malaria is highly seasonal, and it prevents them from getting malaria during those times of year. So SMC is referring to that process. So on the evidence of effectiveness, there are 7 high-quality studies of Malaria Consortium's intervention, so seasonal malaria chemoprevention, that provide strong evidence that it substantially reduces cases of malaria. So this is coming from the academic evidence side of things that I mentioned. We also have a lot of information from Malaria Consortium itself that shows that it is very good at reaching people that it intends to reach, that with people that live in areas that have seasonal malaria with the treatments that it's providing. So we can look at their survey data that they share with us to assess how well they're doing at achieving the implementation of their program. So they have really strong evidence of their own effectiveness as well. So on this criteria of evidence of effectiveness, Malaria Consortium does really well. On cost effectiveness, for Malaria Consortium, we estimate that it costs about $7 to provide a treatment to one child. So this is the seasonal malaria chemoprevention treatment. It's about $7. You'll see on the slide, we estimate that it costs about $3,000 to $5,000 per life saved when we calculate that all out using that $7 per treatment. And I know that's a really big jump from $7 to $3,000 to $5,000. So I want to talk a little bit about how we approach our cost effectiveness estimates and the data and evidence that we use to develop those. So the data inputs for cost effectiveness, I mentioned the academic evidence that we rely on, and ideally those academic studies will be pre-registered and have open data so that, if we wanted to, we could go and check. We also rely on information on the disease burdens in the areas where programs that we're considering operate. So that data might come from government surveys, it might come from the World Health Organization or GBD, which is the Global Burden of Disease, and other sources. So we use information like that to look at the local context in which organizations we're assessing operate. We also look at that monitoring data that I mentioned, so follow-up surveys to check and see how well programs are reaching individuals, cost data, so looking at all the costs to deliver a program, including costs to the government, if the government is also involved in programs, which it often is, costs to teacher time, if a program is happening through a local school. We look at these sort of all-in costs to get a program delivered. And then We also look at other funders' track records. So we want to understand what is really the impact of additional donations on the world. And one question that we ask is, does our decision to recommend something influence whether other funders are also going to support it? So you can imagine kind of two different scenarios. One is that our recommendation, increases confidence in a program, or sets it up so that another funder feels like there's a co-funder involved and they're more likely to get involved because we've decided to fund something. There's also a scenario in which we recommend something and other funders say, you know what, Givewell's got it. We're not going to fund this anymore because they've moved, they've decided to recommend it. And so we actually incorporate our best guesses of how our funding will influence other funders into our cost effectiveness model. And when we're considering all these types of information, we think about how much does each piece of information tell us about the impact of a donation? And I'll show you a few brief screenshots of our cost effectiveness model for Malaria Consortium. We use Excel to do our cost effectiveness modeling. So you'll see this as an Excel sheet. Don't worry about reading the numbers. I just want to give a quick sense of how we calculate this and how it looks. So this is part of our section looking at the number of children that are treated with SMC. This is looking at how effective we think SMC is based on those high quality studies and how likely we think those high quality studies are to replicate and how likely they are to apply to the conditions in which Malaria Consortium works. We look at the baseline malaria mortality rate in the areas where Malaria Consortium works. And we make a bunch of other adjustments. This piece shows just kind of the very bottom of our cost effectiveness model, where we've made a few adjustments for other funders and kind of come up with our final estimate there. As I mentioned, this is not our full model. The actual SMC tab of our cost effectiveness model is 256 rows and a number more columns across than what I've shown just now. And there are a number of other pages of the model. So this is really a very tiny snapshot. But when we put all that together, we estimate that it costs around $3,000 to $5,000 to save one life by donating to Malaria Consortium. So we know that might sound really high, especially if you're used to seeing nonprofit marketing materials that say things like $1 can save a life. But this is really our all-in estimate, taking account all the uncertainties that we have about the quality of evidence, about the impact of our actions on other funders, about how the conditions today are different from the conditions in studies, and puts that all together so that we can really give an estimate that's our best guess of what the actual impact of additional donations to Malaria Consortium would be. So that's Malaria Consortium looking great on cost effectiveness. It also has significant room for more funding. We looked at Malaria Consortium's funding plans and we estimate that they can use another $44.7 million as of the end of 2020 to support their work in 2022 and 2023. So that's plenty of additional funding needs. So we think that additional donor dollars can do a lot and they can absorb them well. Finally, on transparency, Malaria Consortium has shared extensive information about its programs with us. On our review page of Malaria Consortium's seasonal malaria chemoprevention program, there are 139 footnotes. That is not even all of the footnotes that we have about Malaria Consortium or their work throughout our website. So, they're really willing to share a lot of information with us and for us to share that information publicly. So in the end, Malaria Consortium looks like a great fit for a Givewell recommendation, sort of worked its way through the funnel and came out on the bottom as being something that was just super strong on all of our criteria. And so we added it to our list of top charities in 2016, and it remains there today. As you might have sensed from my description of our review process, it's extremely time intensive. We typically spend hundreds of hours assessing the organizations that we recommend to donors. But if you remember, our goal is not to evaluate as many organizations as possible. It's to really dig deeply into the organizations that we think can potentially have the most impact per dollar and perform best on these criteria so that we can recommend them with confidence to donors. So these are the 9 top charities that Elaine mentioned at the start of this conversation. The 9 that we recommend today work on malaria prevention, vitamin A supplementation, vaccination, deworming, and cash transfer programs. And once organizations are added to our list, we don't stop evaluating them. So we are continually evaluating the organizations that are already on our list to make sure that they still need additional funding and to follow the evidence about the effectiveness of their programs. And we have taken top charities off of our list before because of developments on both of those fronts. So we really want to make sure that it's not just that we add an organization to our list and never think about it again. Instead, our list is the places that we feel confident, in each moment, that in real time, that a donor could give to, and we think are great opportunities. So we also spend a lot of time staying up to date on our organization's work once they're added to our list. So before we head over to questions, I just want to briefly touch on 3 of the ways that we could be wrong. There are also other ways that we could be wrong, and I'm happy to talk about those in the Q&A if you have questions about that. But just three that come up often. One is that we should be focusing on new innovation rather than scaling all of these, well-studied existing programs. And we think a lot of donors like funding new things, that they tend to be pretty popular among donors. But we really see a tremendous need for these existing solutions. So malaria remains, one of the largest killers of children across the globe. And there's a large need for funding to prevent malaria and funding to address the problem that exists today. And there are organizations, like I mentioned, like Malaria Consortium is one, a top charity recommend Against Malaria Foundation is another one, that work to address that problem. So we think there are urgent needs that we understand well, but there are existing organizations working to implement. And so we're excited to support those organizations. It doesn't mean that we don't think that research should be happening. We're really glad that other funders are focused on speculative research. It's just not our focus. And I should caveat that there is a separate part of our work called Givewell incubation grants, where we do fund a little bit of research if it looks like it might contribute to potential future top charities. So we do have a little research part of our work, but it's not sort of part of the core work that I just described. The second way that we could be wrong would be, there are more fundamental things that drive progress, and we should be focused on those. So an example here could be economic growth is really important, but figuring out how to cause economic growth is really hard. We think it's probably the result of a complex interplay between a lot of different areas that you can make grants in. And so while we're expanding the scope of things that we can consider in the future and continuing to look at promising programs, including some that are in areas that we would consider harder to measure than the global health organizations that we currently recommend, we don't think that areas that are really difficult to measure are a good fit for our process, because we want to make a public and vettable case to our donors so that people who use our research can kind of see the logic behind it and understand what we've assessed and why we're making the recommendation. So things that are really hard to measure are so far outside of our scope. And then the final way we could be wrong is a philosophical one. You could believe that we just have stronger ethical obligations to people who are in our society and not people who are located farther away from us. And as I mentioned, we don't agree with that view. We want to help people as much as possible, and we're happy to do that regardless of where people are located. So those are some of the ways that we could be wrong. I'm happy to speak more about them during the Q&A. But we are coming up on 30 minutes. So I'm just gonna pause the talk portion here. I hope this was a helpful overview and introduction to what we do. We rely on a lot of different evidence to do our analysis, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. And my colleague Ben is going to join me for the Q&A. As Elaine mentioned, Ben works on marketing, and he can speak about some of the ways that we use data to inform our work on marketing, which was outside of the scope of my presentation, but certainly something we're happy to share more about. So yeah, if you'd like to learn more, you can go to our website or just ask a question during the Q&A. And thank you again for having us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Kat, for a wonderful, very informative, very comprehensive talk. Really enjoyed that. Learned so much. And if you have questions for Catherine and Ben, you can just type them into the chat area, and I will call on you to read your question, or I'm happy to read it for you, whichever your preference is. We love hearing from all of you, but certainly it's up to you as to what your preference is. So the first question, first, great presentation. If I heard correctly, before I do that, would you like to read your question, Alika? Are you there?
I think Alika said, I'm outdoors, so feel free to read it out.
Okay, I see it, yeah. Okay, great presentation. If I heard correctly, Givewell's model accounts for how current ratings analyses might affect future donations. Do you look at prior history for the organization to predict future impact, or do you model at more macro level? Has the model made any unexpected predictions, or a prediction Givewell felt confident about that didn't hold up? And I think you did speak to kind of sometimes when we're wrong. So it sounds like expanding on that.
Yeah. So there are two different ways in which sort of organizations past might inform our assessment of what we think is likely to happen in the future. So we do look at an organization's track record, its success at reaching individuals that it's trying to reach, and its success at expanding, for example, into new countries or new areas, if that's what they're proposing to do, to give a best guess for what we think they're likely to be able to do again in the future. So we might sort of apply an extra uncertainty adjustment if they are proposing to do something that they've never done before. So let's say an organization wants to work in a country they've never worked in before. We might say, we're not sure if they'll be successful. And so we have more uncertainty about that sort of future work that they could do. So that's something that we will sometimes incorporate into our model. Sometimes we make qualitative adjustments. So we want to model things that are reasonable to model. So our model is, as I mentioned, very comprehensive and very large, but there are certain things that we think would also be really difficult to put a number to. And this is a really hard judgment call for us. Like we also, have to put numbers to things that are really difficult to put numbers to in our model because we think they are important to model. So it's not that, everything the model is extremely certain and everything the qualitative adjustments that we make after the fact is extremely uncertain. It's all on a spectrum. But we will make qualitative adjustments for some factors that might include things like, the organization's operational strength, sort of how well we think they are likely to work with partners, if that's something that they're proposing. So factors like that might come into play qualitatively. But yes, I think that's sort of the spectrum of things. And if you want to actually see what we include and exclude, there's a tab in our model that says, like, these are the things we're including, and then here are some things that we are excluding. We're not putting them in the model because we don't think they're a good fit for the model. This question might have also related to the adjustment that I mentioned that we make for funders and how our actions affect other funders, because it mentioned future donations. And so we do try to account for our best guess of what our activities will cause like other major international aid organizations to do, or past funders of an organization. We'll speak to them to try to get a sense of like how they're thinking about that, or we'll speak to other sort of groups in the space to try to triangulate what we think is likely to happen with funding. But a really key piece of things is that we do tend to recommend organizations that can absorb a very large amount of donations, so that if we recommend something and it causes it to receive a lot of donations, we want to make sure that they absolutely have enough ability to absorb that. Though, as I mentioned, there was a time in the past where we recommended a top charity, directed a ton of funding to them, and then they weren't spending it as quickly as we would have wanted. So we decided to take them off of our list for a year while they were spending that funding before directing them additional dollars. So that's something that we have done in the past as well.
Okay, thank you, Kat. Maura, you have a question.
Yeah, hi Kat. Thank you for your presentation. I mean, you touched on this a bit in your talk, but I just wanted to see if you could expand a little more. It seems like so the criteria is very data driven, but I'm just sort of curious about how like then you, I guess, crunch or analyze that data to like fit into your parameters, if that makes sense. Like you have 9 for this year, but does that vary other years? Like how are they? Does that get the data get analyzed to be part of your list?
Yeah, so this kind of goes back to the funnel picture. Oh, I'm not sharing my screen anymore. I'm not going to do that, but picture a funnel. So we're kind of back at the top of the funnel and thinking about like all the things that we could potentially recommend. And the very first step of the funnel, we basically do mini reviews of all the things that seem promising by those 4 criteria. So we might do like a 1-day version of looking at the available evidence of effectiveness, cost effectiveness, transparency, and room for more funding within a certain program. And things that still look promising after a few hours might go on to like a few days of review, and then a few weeks, and then months, and then, you know, it could be a year or more to get to the top charity situation. And so in every case, we're kind of like building out more and more granular cost effectiveness modeling. So we start with just like an extremely rough back of the envelope calculation. So it might really look like something, you know, here's our best guess for how much it would cost to implement the program. Often when we're looking at that at the very first stage, that information is coming from academic studies, which we know is not as predictive of the real world because, you know, studies are done like potentially in the past, they're done with more monitoring, they just might be more expensive. So we look at the costs from studies, but we know that's probably going to change. And then we look at like rough guesses for how much impact it could have, also knowing it could change, and just put together this really simple back of the envelope model. And then the more time we spend with the program, the more we are building that, like, you know, what became the 256 row Malaria Consortium model, and incorporating more adjustments and more factors to try to dig into what is likely to be our final estimate if they do become a top charity. Is that sort of the direction of your question, or is there another piece of this?
Yeah. I guess it's more like, do your parameters change each year? Like this year there's 9. Have there been years where there's more or less, or like it just seems like there's so much information to like calculate how you sort of grade everything, because the charities I'm sure can be different too across the board.
Oh yeah. Okay, great question. Yes. So we basically operate with like a cost effectiveness bar that we're looking for things to be better than. So we look for top charities to exceed a certain degree of cost effectiveness. That bar has changed over time, in part because our cost effectiveness models change over time. So there's a little bit of us saying like, well, we have a lot of cost effectiveness, we have a lot of funding that's in the space of like being, you know, in that $3,000 to $5,000 to save a life range. And so that's kind of the bar that we're applying. We want to find something that's as good or better than that. So that's like one way. So we don't have a set number of charities that we're looking to recommend. Like if there were 20 charities over our bar, that would be fine, though we might start to like run into, you know, communicating about 20 charities to donors. We'd have to think about how we'd want to rank them, but there's no set number. I think the lowest number we've ever had in one year was 3 in our past. Once organizations get onto our list, they can be taken off, but often they stay on. So I would say our list tends to get longer over time than shorter over time, because organizations that make the list just have gone through such a rigorous review process that, like, while there are reasons that we might not recommend them in the future, it's more common that like they have met this really high bar and will continue to meet it. Yeah, so that's how we think about, you know, the sort of bar for being a top charity.
What does Givewell think about charities that do not, how does Givewell collect donations on behalf of its recommended charities?
Yeah, so Ben, do you want to talk about our donations?
Yeah, sure, I'm happy to. So kind of the we really judge our success by the amount of money we're able to direct to the charities we recommend, rather than like money we're raising for Givewell as an organization. So like my push as the person who's working on our growth projects and the push of our team who works on outreach is really to encourage those donations. We do donations processing ourselves, and all of like the funds come through us, and then all of that goes to the charity, excluding like whatever credit card processing fees and like things that we generally don't have a control over. Those will go directly to the charity. Donors can give to us, and then we will like push those through. They can also just go and give directly to the charity. There's a couple of reasons. Like one, we like people to give through us because it just gives us visibility into how effective we are. We are trying to promote these charities, and so it's just easier to track. We do track both, and we come up with estimates of what goes through directly to the charities, but it's much harder to understand our own impact when we don't have that visibility. And then part of it is also that I think we talk about recommending charities, but we can recommend a program within a charity. And so I think Kat talked about Malaria Consortium Seasonal Malaria Chemo Prevention Program, which is a good example where we actually recommend that program within a larger charity, but we recommend that specific program, which we think is especially cost effective. And so a lot of times it's actually challenging to donate to the specific program that we might recommend at an organization. And in those cases, some donors will go through us because it's a way to restrict that funding to the specific effective program.
Mm-hmm. How does Givewell support itself?
Yeah. Or Ben, do you want to take it?
I'm sure. People can give to our operations. And so we just have donors who have appreciated the work that we do and donate to our operations. That has, at some point, if we have too much operational funding, we actually do re-granting of that funding to the organizations that we recommend, because again, that's really how we expect our impact will happen, is via growing donations to our recommended charities.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's on our website. Like if we hit a certain amount of, we're holding funding that has been given unrestricted to us, it goes to our recommended organizations. And we also cap the amount of funding from like individuals, because we don't want to rely too much on a single funding source. So from any given individual, we'll cap the total.
This is somewhat related to an earlier question, which is why I paused a bit, but I'll come back to it. Sure. What does Givewell think about charities that do not qualify for its top ranking? So, if someone wanted to take that personally, it's a very short list. So, oh my gosh, I didn't make the short list. So just give us more perspective on that.
Yeah. So, we're really laser focused at answering this question of like, how can we find and recommend organizations that, we can recommend with confidence, which means they're strongly evidence backed. They need to have a lot of information supporting their impact, and that meet this extremely high bar of cost effectiveness. And, many organizations and programs just like haven't been that well studied. There's lots of programs that don't have that kind of research. I mentioned that some causes are just more difficult to measure. So, I mentioned economic growth as an example of an area where economic growth would be really good. Like that's a really good thing to do to improve people's, welfare, but it's also very difficult to know what to do to cause economic growth. Economists spend a lot of time debating that. And so there are things that are just like more difficult to measure, things that are more difficult to know what you could support, and things that are, just also less cost effective. And so, we've said that we're committed to really focusing deeply on this question, but there's lots of things outside of that scope that, wouldn't fit for one reason or another. And it doesn't mean that, we think that everything we don't recommend is bad, but we really are laser focused on finding the things that we can recommend most confidently to our donors, which is, our focus that we serve.
Thank you for presenting to us. Or Bronwyn, did you want to share? Are you there? Or I'll read it. Have other charity evaluation organizations asked Givewell to inform their methodology, like those for areas outside of Givewell's focus?
Yeah, so we're happy to share our methodology with everyone. It's all on our website. So we definitely are excited for and like glad for others to look at how we approach our cost effectiveness modeling, to use anything that we do. We share a lot of information about how we approach this work. So it's definitely not trade secrets. And then there are a few organizations that we're aware of that have taken a similar lens to animal welfare. I know is one area where there's been kind of an explicit Givewell for animal welfare developed. And I think, other organizations that are sort of operating in our similar space, but looking into slightly different cause areas. So yes, basically there are other organizations. Sometimes we're in touch with them. Sometimes we hope they just use our research and maybe we don't know about it, but we're really happy to share if we can be helpful.
And I'll ask the last question for the evening. How have the COVID times impacted interest in Givewell, and is the relatively short list of charities that you endorse something that is a disadvantage in the times we're in, where people might want a broader list to choose from beyond the scope of who you work with? Yeah.
Ben, do you want to talk about COVID?
Yeah, I think I can talk about both. I think COVID has, we've seen it's a little bit unclear. I know we've seen a really strong increase in interest we saw in 2020, and we see continuing into 2021. I'm unsure of how much of that can be attributed to COVID versus something else, but it's very hard to tease that out when COVID is what's happening in the world and it is very present. I do think we saw around the start of COVID last year, a really visible spike in just general interest in web traffic coming to us and in new donations. So I think there is at least some connection of people who kind of are motivated to try and help others more or something along those lines, along with organic growth around people who are learning about Givewell and the organizations that we recommend. And then on the, I think that our short list of charities has generally been a really strong benefit for us. I'm not sure how much the length matters, but I do think that our recommendations really cater to a fairly specific worldview. I think it's, people who want to help as much as possible and are kind of neutral on the cause that they want to give to and are really looking for evidence to help guide their recommendations. We really help address that. And I think if you are neutral on cause, and that's not kind of a primary filter when you're deciding where to give, I think, our lack of recommendations across a set of cause areas isn't as much of a handicap because people aren't necessarily looking for the best organization within some specific cause bucket that they're really trying to choose based on it first. And I think if people are giving that way, it's kind of we're a more challenging site to use because we just don't have that set of recommendations.
Great.
Could I just quickly add on COVID to the programs that we recommended, a lot of them serve essential health functions. And so we're still very much needed during COVID. So it wasn't, some of them faced operational difficulties, but many of them, for example, the malaria programs were still implementing their malaria prevention programs because that was still very important during COVID. So we still saw, significant funding needs last year at our organizations. So the things that we were pointing our donors to continue to be places where, we felt that they could use donations really well, including in the near term.
Well, thank you. On that note, we're going to conclude for the evening. Again, we very much appreciate having Kat and Ben inspire us this evening about Givewell to learn more. And again, givewell.org if you want to learn more about the organization. So again, thanks to you both. And I will be in touch on our next meetup, more information to come, but hope that you will join us once we have issued that information. And also, if you're interested in hearing Kat and Ben again, the video will be sent out to everyone. Thank you all for attending, and thank you to our speakers. Good night.